All right. Okay, I think we're live now.
Cool.
All right. Hi, Eddie.
Hi, how's it going, David?
Good, good. Thanks for joining me today. This is a lot of fun.
I'm
And
excited.
mute the regular stream audio here. All right. So thanks for joining me today. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I thought today it would be fun just to give folks a chance to hear from somebody who is a published graphic novelist as well as an accomplished artist in his own right. Now, you have experience with Disney as well.
Yeah.
And why don't you talk a little bit more about your work, Eddie?
Well, I've been a professional cartoonist now for since around 1990. Started out as a theme park caricaturist, and people paid me money, so that's professional, right?
That helps. That helps.
After many years and many thousands of faces of that, I found my way into Disney feature animation down here in Florida, and worked on about about 4 Disney feature films: Mulan, Tarzan, Lilo and Stitch, a couple others.
Wait a minute. Hang on. I've never heard of any of those. What are they about?
Yeah, they're small movies, and yeah, so that was fun. That got me into the animation industry, and from there I did some freelance, worked on, directed my own video project, or well, I directed it. It was produced by a laser company here in town, and where we did a 360 degrees by 180 degrees fully animated short for planetariums.
Now, what does that mean? 300 by 180.
Well, you're surrounded 360 degrees, and 180 degrees above you. It's a half dome, fully animated film.
Wow.
And no one had ever done hand-drawn animation for. It's called full dome, but it's half a sphere. So no one had ever done hand-drawn animation before. So that was quite a challenge of figuring out how do we do that.
Mm.
That was a good 10 years before Glenn Keane started doing that same kind of thing for Google.
Mm-hmm.
Ours didn't look as good, but we pioneered that. Yeah. And different projects, worked on some VeggieTales stuff, and eventually found myself in a second tour of duty with Disney, working on a little show called Phineas and Ferb, where I got to do some writing, some storyboard work, and even a little bit of voice work. I got to play the voice of Darth Vader for the Phineas and Ferb Star Wars.
Well, now, of course, I have to ask you to do it.
Oh, I don't know if I can do it. I don't have anything to talk into to echo. But
what did you have to do to make the voice?
Well, the funny thing is, I was not the original Darth Vader voice. I'd already cast the part, and I did the temporary audio, and which I'd actually recorded on my Snowball mic on my in GarageBand, and they loved it, but they'd already cast one of the official Darth Vader voices, and so they recorded the guy who was only one line, and Dan and Swampy, the creators of Phineas and Ferb, just decided, we kind of like Eddie's better. I think I kind of captured the more of the spirit of the original movie.
That's kind of nice to be told.
Yeah, it was very flattering. I think I got a little more, because I was doing an impression of James Earl Jones. And so I captured a little more of the funk in his voice in the 1970s version, and that's what we were trying to go for. So
nice. So
yeah, that was a blast. And then while I was working on Phineas and Ferb, I was also doing my webcomic, Red's Planet. And by the time we wrapped up the show, I had about 140 pages and was looking to find a publisher and an agent. And so I was excited about launching that, and that's what I ended up doing as soon as I left the show.
That's great. Yeah. Now I have a copy of Red's Planet here, and it is awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, because I've told you in the past, but for people who don't know about Red's Planet, it's a great story. Eddie, can you give a little bit of a breakdown of the story?
Well, Red's Planet, and it's a 3-book series. The first 2 books are out, but Red's Planet is about a little girl named Red, a little Earth girl, who is mistakenly kidnapped by a UFO because, that happens. And through a series of events, she finds herself whisked across the galaxy and marooned on a distant planet with a menagerie of misfit aliens. And there's also on the planet a custodian of sorts, who's this felinoid, grumpy cat alien.
Mhm.
And she finds herself in a contest of wills with him. And so she begins to realize, this really isn't much different than living in my foster home back on Earth. And somehow she has to figure out how not only to survive on this planet, but to make it home.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, it's a funny story too, and that character now, I wouldn't be out of line saying that he has a bit of an Indiana Jones vibe.
That's very interesting. The Goose, the caretaker of the planet,
Mhm.
you got an Indiana Jones vibe from him, like a
Yeah.
sword.
Yeah, yeah.
Very funny.
Are we talking about the same character?
He's the cat, right?
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
This giant kind of he's kind of a lion who's in the Middle Ages, and the glory of his mane has been, it's fallen out.
Mhm.
His
He's
better days are behind him,
he's
and
well
he's a little
withered, yeah.
grumpy about that. But yeah, at times it's funny when I was writing him. Originally, he started out as kind of a Walter Matthau character.
Oh, okay, I can see that.
But
Yeah.
there was a point where it's funny because as I was writing dialogue, I started hearing Harrison Ford's voice at times.
Mhm.
And so it's very funny that it actually comes through
Mhm.
in some of the dialogue. And that's amazing to me that, we can write graphic novels and we don't really have control of how people read the books and what voices they hear. But you've done your job when they kind of pick up on the influences or just the emotional content, or that it becomes real to them, like an animated film inside their head.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and that's something I'm really hoping for with the Yuka project
Yeah,
is that, it's an unusual project, because you really don't see too many projects quite like this. There are game adaptations, but uh, I'm almost trying to do. Usually, they kind of have this kind of cash in philosophy. It's like, oh, the game did fairly well. Let's make a bunch of merchandise.
right.
And the book I'm treating just the same as if it was an original intellectual property that I was developing on my
Yeah.
own. And in fact, it's funny. I mean, Eddie, you know about my Dreamside concept.
Yes.
Well, I think I've actually put more time. I mean, Dreamside stretched out a longer period of time,
Yeah.
but Yuka, for the actual final pass of Dreamside, all the way through 150 something pages, I actually spent more time on Yuka so far, and I still have 6 months to go.
Yeah.
So it's certainly not that type of project, and so it's actually it's pretty rare that people will just kind of do this sort of thing. And I'm hoping that the fan base of Yuka, in particular, will find the unbelievably large amount of references and in
Yeah.
jokes, and
Well,
also
I
that they go all the way back to the earlier catalog of Rare history.
I think first of all, the reason you've probably put more time into it is um, you feel responsible. You've got someone else's baby in your
Mhm.
control here, and you need to do the best you can. I completely understand that. But there's another thing is when properties are licensed most of the time, they aren't given to people who necessarily even know the property or
Mhm.
even care about it. So I think there's something really special about you having taking on this project and of a property that you really like and love,
Oh, I love
and
it.
you want to create something that you want to read, and not often we don't see that kind of licensing often. So
Mhm, and one thing to add to that as well is it's also rare to work with a studio like Playtonic,
yeah,
which gives me that degree of freedom.
yeah,
After working on, which is a tough thing to balance because you want to make sure that fans understand that this is a genuine project, that it's going to have the right vibe, that the studio likes it,
sure,
but also that you want to have the freedom to make something new and wonderful in its own right, and that requires having some freedom, and that requires having a studio to trust you. So it really is kind of a perfect storm. And I think the general key, and this will branch perfectly into what I want to talk to you about next, Eddie, is independence and just having a general approach of freedom, at all stages, both in terms of who you're working with and what you're producing. Now we're doing slightly different things in terms of the release of the book.
Hmm.
But we both come from the same position of wanting to make something new, original, special, and
Yeah.
just the way that we want it. And we just have different approaches. But I'll tell you what, before we do that, I
Sure.
wanted to read a couple of comments that people have written here. Well, actually, there's one here for you that says, "Wow, wow, what a legend Eddie Pittman is. I never knew." How do you like that?
Is that Ed
You
Steckley? Who?
you
Who
are
is that?
you are a legend. You are a legend. And I never knew how involved he was with so many of my childhood memories.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks, Mom.
yes, thanks, Eddie's mom. No, that's not Eddie's mom. In fact, I think I know who that might be because he's been a fantastic supporter of this project so far.
Great.
And so I really appreciate you coming to the chat. So let's see what else we have here. Is anyone excited for the new tiers and looking to upgrade? Yes, you are all excited to upgrade. You should all upgrade to the most expensive possible tier. That will
You were
really help.
getting sleepy.
Yeah. Why doesn't that work, Eddie?
I don't know.
I can't decide if I want to upgrade or not yet. Yes, I can't. Well, maybe wait a little bit until, well, first of all, wait until they exist. And secondly, wait until I can give you a better description of what they look like because there's some cool stuff coming. If you're a backer already, then you probably have seen the pin update that I just sent out. I'm really proud of this pin, Eddie. This
Oh,
is going to
cool.
be, it's a,
Like like an enamel pin.
yes, it's an enamel pin, but I think it's going to be like a 3-inch pin,
Yeah.
like a serious, the something that will make you really popular in school if you wear it,
That's
from
awesome.
your favorite video game ukulele.
Yeah.
And but it's going to be a beautiful thing. And I was talking with trying to find the right people to work with, and it's looking like I'm going to be able to get it produced in the USA.
That's
So
great.
it'll match the book production, which is being done in Nashville. It's
Cool.
great. It costs more money, but the beautiful part is that it gives me a lot of control. It means that everything's done. They take on the responsibility of making sure that the book is done properly, good communication, fast shipping,
And
all these nice things.
and there's less of a language barrier with Nashville. Although I'm from the South, so I know that there is a language barrier. So I can say that.
There is, yeah, yeah. Well, good. Well, let's branch into that topic and talk about being an independent and how that differs between us a little bit. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And just so people know, when we're talking about independent, we're talking about projects that have a singular vision or a small team of people working. Because as we were talking the other night, my book's actually published by a pretty large publisher in New York, Abrams Books, and but since it's not a property of a major or a major property like a Disney property or Marvel. Then I have pretty broad creative control, and there are times that my editor makes suggestions, and a lot of times I certainly take those suggestions because Charlie Kochman has been in the business for a very long time. Um, but for the most part, he's left me alone and to dig my own grave or make my own decisions, as it may be.
Hmm.
So it's nice because I definitely had uh, a specific vision of what I wanted to create, and I'm glad that I didn't have to go back and rewrite things just for a publisher who thinks they know what kids want to read. So
Yeah, yeah. One of the funny things about that, you hear often people talk about how important it is to have control, but it usually stops just before that statement gets interesting. At least for me as an independent artist, it's not just about having control.
mhm,
It's more that when you have people making direction decisions over you,
yeah,
it's not that they're wrong or right. It's that everything is a process. It's like the Disney Imagineer process. Do you ever hear about the seven people rule from
no,
Disney Imagineers? Well, basically, I learned this. I was at a film festival when I used to live in Los Angeles. It was a Disney Imagineer was there. He was talking about the process that they go through when they're brainstorming.
mhm,
He says they're only allowed to have 7 people in the room at one time, so they don't go above 7 people. Because when you go above 7 people, people feel intimidated to participate. They kind of just sort of sit and listen, and you want to engage people and have that independence, and that requires a small number of people.
yeah,
But also they have the yes and philosophy, where you're not allowed to say no to anybody. You can only say yes and. That's the rule. And what this guy was telling me is that they come up with a gajillion concepts every week, because when you're told no, just flat out no, it shuts you down. It shuts down your creativity.
Yep.
And you have to take time to rebuild your confidence, your creative confidence, to participate again. With yes and, what they'll basically do is they'll say, oh, all right, what's an idea? All right, how about a ride with I want to ride where you can fly. Okay. And then someone else, instead of saying, well, that's idiotic, of course people can't fly, someone will say yes and with hot air balloons. All right. And
Sure.
then someone else can't say, no, we can't build hot air balloons. And they have to say yes and, oh, the people control the hot air balloons. And then someone else have to say yes and something else. And then this happens exponentially more quickly, because everyone is feeling a lot of positivity in the meeting, and you end up with brilliant concepts by the end of the day. And so with publishers are working in the industry in general, like in the game industry, for example, with my experience, I've had many times where people have an overly negative reaction, or they just are very abrupt in saying, no, okay, we can't do that, or whatever. We're not going to do that. That's a dumb idea. And it actually, it hurts the project in the long run. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit about how do you, it sounds like you have a great working relationship with the publisher, but maybe you can speak a little bit about that and how that affects you.
Well, I'm honestly, at the times of production, they're so hands off. There's not even a lot of yes and. There's always suggestions, and I've learned some things that just don't go into comics because of the because of the typeface and how letters blend together. Like, you can't use, when someone flicks a light switch, you can't use the sound effect word flick, because it doesn't look like flick once you type it out in a comic font. So I've learned things along the way that I didn't know before. Well, I thought I knew most of those. But for the most part, there isn't even that kind of feedback on, and I know the yes and thing that you're talking about. And I'm curious, because when I was at Disney, it was very much a no but kind of place. Because of the people who were running the division at the time. They used to shut down a lot of people. Now, I was not very high up in the company. I was at the very bottom. But I know that the yes and philosophy was originally adopted by Pixar, and it was part of their creative process.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, Pete Docter has talked about it quite a bit, and I think Andrew Stanton has as well. So I'm curious of when that made it into Disney Imagineering.
Well, now I want to check, because maybe the guy was trying to steal credit.
No, it's actually a psychological or hypnotists talk about it as well, because it opens up the mind for more creativity and more accessibility. Once you do say no, everything shuts down, and mind and the people become defensive. So just avoiding the word no keeps everyone talking and creating. And our process on Phineas and Ferb was very similar. Working for Dan and Swampy was really good, because they weren't quick to say no. They were willing to see what you had and where you wanted to take it. And oftentimes we'd take a story off on a tangent, and they would say, let's forget everything else we've done and just go in this direction. And that's really embracing creativity.
So this might sound like the most obvious statement, but I guess to break it down in a way is, it sounds like a good publisher is one that gives you the freedom to create something beautiful, original, and high quality, but also is able to know when no has to be said, and also knows how to communicate that.
Yeah, I think when no is said, it's when you're up against a deadline, and these books have to be put out on a schedule. And so ultimately it's a business, and that's when no's have to be said, but within reason. Abrams has been great to work with creatively.
Yeah, that's something that the deadline is always something that artists struggle with, right?
Yes.
The more invested you are in a project, the more you want to continue to work on it, and polish and polish and polish. And here's something kind of funny is, with the Yuka art for the book, I've been able to take a lot of time to kind of over polish the pages a little bit. I'm trying to do a very, very finely rendered style. So I keep having these stages. When I started, I did a test page for it. And for the dream side art, which I put up on my Twitter page, by the way, when I started with Dreamside, I wanted to have a really kind of lush, almost kind of old school, kind of 70s or 80s style of illustration where there's a lot of rendering, and try and mix that with some kind of thicker outlines. And obviously, there's a lot of manga influence in there as well.
Yeah.
And the but one of the things that I do with Dreamside's art is I do both soft shadows, but then I also like to do a lot of bounce lighting or rim lighting on the character. So I'll paint in a lot of bounce light, like a lot of tertiary light or secondary bounce light. And so I'll have a separate pass for that, right? It's like I'll put the shadow in and I'm like, okay, now I got to do the the bounce light. And it's a long process because it's almost like painting a second soft shadow layer. So not only am I doing soft shadows, but I'm doing soft bounce light too. And so that's how you get that kind of nice smooth rendering. Sometimes I yo-yo back and forth and say, this almost looks good just with flat color, and like I actually like it better than I do rendered. But overall, I prefer the rendered look. But here's the thing: it takes a long time. And when I worked on the test page, I remember I don't want to say promising myself, but telling myself, "There's no way I'm going to do bounce light in Yuka. I'm going to keep it like relatively sharp, comic-y shadows. It's going to be cartoonier, and I'm not going to do bounce light because it takes too long." Of course, here I am doing an extra stage of bounce light. I now do 2 stages of bounce light.
Well,
I can't stop doing that.
Yeah. One thing I discovered the hard way, because you never know until that book comes back and everything's printed, of how it's going to look. When I was originally doing Red's Planet as a web comic, and you've got these RGB pages up on the web, people can see subtleties in the color and textures that you just can't see in the book. And what size is your book going to be?
Right now we're looking at 7.25 by 9.5.
Okay, all right. So mine was 6 by 9, so which is the standard size for the kids' graphic novels these days. And Abrams traditionally they started as an art publisher. They know how to do beautiful art books, and so the printing's beautiful. It's just that a lot of the subtleties of the textures and rendering that I had done on the webcomic weren't coming through. So that was nice to finally see, because then I could cut out a little bit of extra work on the pages I was doing on the second book, and you don't see the difference for the most part.
Yeah, so it's about finding proportion, and understanding, all right, this thing that I could spend a day on this thing that no one's ever going to notice.
Exactly, and you don't know, and that's the hard thing about doing a graphic novel, is that you do 192 pages of content, and then before you get to see it printed. If you're doing a monthly comic, and then there's 22 pages, and you get to see it in a few months, and okay, I can pull back a little bit on textures and rendering. People, it's just not quite coming through.
Yeah, because one thing that I realized, and I feel unintelligent for not realizing this earlier, is that when I was working on both Dreamside and Yuka, I would do print tests, and so I would print out pages at the right size. But then I realized that I was printing at 600 DPI.
Yep.
And so I'd be looking and say, oh, I can see all these details. But then I realized that the book will be in a 4-color press, and it won't have the same degree of detail. It'll be more of that kind of, it'll be a press. So you won't notice all those details. But furthermore, this is something that I see a lot with digital comics. And one of the things that bothers me a lot, that I've been very conscious to avoid, is where this is sort of one of the digital problems, where when you work on a traditional page, you can't zoom in. You can get closer to it, but you can't zoom into the page, of course, because it's real. So and your pen, you can only, the smaller you draw, the smaller an area you're trying to cover, you don't really have any more control. You're just trying very hard to get into a little area and maintain control. So there's a unity throughout the whole page. But often what happens with digital work, and it's very tempting to do this, is to zoom in on areas where there's a lot of detail. Where and this way you can get refined lines and it's beautiful. But then when you zoom out, suddenly you've got this congestion of detail with tiny little lines, and it's way out of proportion for the rest of the page.
That's something that's very common. My I used to work with a guy named Tom Richmond, who is now the Mad Magazine's top caricature artist, does the movie satires for Mad.
Mm.
And I remember Tom saying when he first started doing digital, and he inks traditionally, but he would scan everything in and color in Photoshop, that he spent like an hour working on this rendering of a character, and then he zoomed out. He forgot how small this character was, and realizes that he's just tiny in the whole spread of work, and he just wasted an hour rendering this guy.
Oh, an hour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's easy to forget that. There's a couple of ways that I get around that. And one is to open up an extra window of your art. If you're coloring in Photoshop, you can do this, and so that you have the full image on your second monitor.
Mm-hmm.
And as you zoom in and color on your Cintiq, you can look over to the monitor, the full page, just to keep reminding yourself of how small this is and how it's going to look.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The other, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, just in response to that, because since I'm actually working on the iPad, and I'm using Procreate. So one of the cool things you can do with that is it's so rapid to zoom in and out. It even has, like, if you pinch quickly, it'll pop the page to its full size, and then you can just
pinch right back in.
Yeah. So I've gotten used to
there's another aspect too. It's closer to the size that you're printing in.
Right.
So that is a nice thing. When I had my original Cintiq, which was the 21UX, I had it mounted in an animation table, so it would spin around.
I've seen people do that.
Yeah, we had a guy, a former Disney animator, who made the adapters and sold them to us for about $30 each. So what I would do a lot of times is turn my Cintiq into portrait mode, essentially.
Oh, okay. So
that way I could work on the full page, and it was basically the same size as working on a 11 by 17 sheet of Bristol board.
Right, because this is the widescreen Cintiq, right?
Well, no, it was the original. It was the 21UX, but the size. Yeah, well, yeah, they weren't quite the 16 by 9 aspect ratio back then, because it was pre-digital, pre-HD video.
Yeah, they're wonderful devices. I have a mobile studio. I'm just not using it as much because for me, the most important thing is I'm crazy about getting out of the house when I'm working, and battery life is a pretty big issue. But it's also the iPad, just specifically with Procreate. It has a very rapid control, but I have a lot of trouble using kind of the mainline applications. I mean, it does have Clip Studio, which is great, but that's still quite a bit easier, frankly, on the Wacom devices and on a desktop computer to kind of do the main management stuff.
Sure.
But I do most of the drawing now on the iPad. I just want to jump in here real quick and let folks know that if you want to ask Eddie any questions, or if you have any questions for me, go ahead and type them in, and I will ask them. This is a cool opportunity to talk to somebody who worked on some really neat things. So if there's any curiosity on your part, go ahead and type it up. Oh, and Eddie, our mutual friend Matthew Rallier is here.
Oh, Matt,
and has left a heart.
So, I forgot that's how we knew each other. It was Matt.
It was Matt. It was Matt. Matt. It's funny because we connected through Matt right around the time that I was about to launch the trailer for the Dreamside video series I was making.
And you made the mistake of asking me my advice.
It was some of the most helpful advice I got, actually. It was I think your suggestion was great, because you suggested taking out kind of a really boring opening, almost like 45 seconds from the trailer. So that was really helpful. It kind of jumped right into a good shot to start with, instead of wasting time with this long, drawn out introduction.
Yeah, trailers are funny because you really have a matter of seconds to grab everyone. And,
I think there's this new phenomenon I call the 25% phenomenon, where because everything's on YouTube, people will open up the video and then they'll just jump the bar right to 25%. I know I do this a lot. And it kind of skips the intro, and I can just very quickly check and see if this is something of interest to me, and then I'll watch the video if I was interested at the 25% mark. Yeah, yeah. So I'm curious a little bit about the artistic process, Eddie. Like, I mean, I know we talked in the past about it, but let's start with story. How do you think about story?
Um, I coming from a film background and wanting to be a filmmaker since I was in high school, I really see everything. And I have a cat here that keeps trying to jump into my lap. So if you see a tail,
I didn't know we were going to have another guest.
yeah, so here we go. He's going to get tangled up, and so so I think of things in film terms. I think of a story in terms of a hour and 90 minutes or 2 hours. And then from there, I break it down into, and I write it as a screenplay. My first draft is after, okay, excuse me, Finster. This is not going to work, buddy. You got to hop down. Finster. Yes, it's, yes, big long name actually, but Finster is the one we ended up calling him. It was Dr. Dean Friedrich Newton Amadeus, and there's a bunch of other stuff there, which I can't remember right now. We, instead of just giving him one name, we just kept giving him names, and they weren't working, so we just add another name to it until we just had one big long name. So I think of it as a screenplay, and I'll do a step outline, and I'll start with note cards, writing my scenes on note cards, and oftentimes color coded note cards, so I can follow a certain subplot or a story arc. And the great thing about the note cards is they're mobile. I can put them in a pile, go to a coffee shop, work on them, and then come home, sit down on the living room floor and put them on the floor and move them around. If there's a scene that's not working, I can pull it out. And so it's a great way to work. And it's very similar to how we worked writing episodes of Phineas and Ferb. Once I have the basic structure there, I go to an outline, and then start fleshing the scenes out and jumping in and writing dialogue. But I write it first as a screenplay because I think in those terms, and I see my graphic novels as movies. And once I'm there, I start to break it down for a graphic novel. And a lot of times that means having to cut out dialogue and figure out what the page breaks are going to be. And once I have a script, I can start going into the layout stage of drawing the comic. And from there, and I work in, I write in Scrivener, love Scrivener, since everything gets kept in one nice file.
What is Scrivener?
Have you not used it?
No.
Scrivener is a program for writing. It is there's very simple elements to Scrivener, but the thing I like about it is that everything is kept into one single file. And so I can put all my research in there. I can have different pages of notes or character development. And then when you're ready to print out, you just you compile what you want to print, and you just check off which which folders or which pages you want to print. I learned about it from the National Writing, the NaNoWriMo, National, what is that? National Novel Writing Month.
National Writing thingy.
Yeah, National Novel Writing Month, which is always November, NaNoWriMo, and where people take the entire month of November and write a 40,000 word novel.
Yeah, I've got a good friend who's done that a few times.
Yeah. So I write in Scrivener, and then I'm doing primarily my artwork now for the book in Clip Studio Paint.
Yeah.
And what I love about that is I can have my entire graphic novel structure there, and the inking tools are wonderful. The drawing tools are terrific. I used to go to Photoshop to color, but Clip Studio Paint now has the best flatting tools available, where you can just click and fill. You don't even have to be on the same level or the same layer that you're filling on.
Right. Yeah.
And and the painting tools are wonderful too. So I primarily do everything there until it's time to composite all the dialogue. I don't like their the way that they handle text, and my publisher wants editable text, and I can't do that in the Clip Studio.
Right. Yeah, that is a problem. Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
compatible with other software.
Yeah, but I do my dialogue balloons there. They've got great tools for creating those, and then I just compile everything in Photoshop for the art director.
That's one of those crazy things that I'm doing with the Yuka book is I've got custom dialogue bubbles. We'll see if it's a good idea or if it's annoying. But I have custom dialogue bubbles that are iconic for the particular character talking.
Yeah.
So like Yuka, I have because he has the curly tail that he uses as a weapon in the game.
Yeah.
It just curls up. So I have little curly corners on his, and then Laylee's is kind of like the broad, iconic shape of her head because she has these sharp ears, these big ears, but then she also has the sort of kind of bat jowl things, the kind of hair that comes down. So I kind of have this kind of points on both sides. You know, when I was working on it too, it was trouble because the points looked like arrows, and so I had to get the size of those points just right, so it didn't confuse the reader on who was speaking.
I think it's a great idea. My favorite cartoonist of all time was Walt Kelly, and he used to do that quite a bit for certain characters. Would have different kind of dialogue balloons. But so, did you create those? A library of those that you could just pull in and adjust?
That would have been very smart, but nope. Well, I think the problem is that all right, so maybe this is something that you can address a little bit. I have this is a technical question I'm going to pose to Eddie here that maybe you can save me some time. Eddie, I'm the kind of person who I am aware that there are intelligent ways to do things, but I'm also aware that if I take the time to change my process to adopt these intelligent new methods, it actually ends up taking me longer.
I hear you.
Sometimes I just bulldoze through with the stupid way because I get it done, and then I think, oh, I'll figure out a more intelligent way later. It never happens.
Yeah.
So word bubbles fall into this category, but one of the main problems that I had with getting base balloons is, you're either working with raster graphics or vector graphics.
Sure.
And the challenge with the bubbles is I'm using a line that I want to stay consistent. And if I need different sizes, and not so much different sizes, but different ratios of the balloon, of course, I don't want to just scale the balloon because then it will make the line very wide and unattractive. Now, I know with vector, that is not an issue, but I guess my concern with it was that I felt it was just easier for me to be able to go in and get the personality that I wanted because there's even, I try to integrate personality into everything, even in the word balloons. So I can make one a little bit more aggressive if I want to. One is a little sharper, one's a little softer, rounder, depending on the shape of the text. So I can get the most perfectly ideal layout that I can possibly get because I'm always moving stuff around. We both have spent some time in storyboarding, right, Eddie?
Yeah.
So with storyboarding, and maybe this is your experience as well, I found comics to be significantly harder than storyboarding.
Oh yeah.
Because whereas I thought it was going to be a cinch, I thought, oh, I can do storyboarding, I can do shots and cinematics and stuff. Okay, what's the big deal with a comic? It's just a bunch of shots. And I thought, no, because you got panels next to panels on a page, and you have compositions within compositions.
Yeah.
And it's torture to the layout obsessed artist.
Yeah.
Because you want an easy way to explain it is we have this thing called the rule of thirds, and maybe I'll have two panels at the top of the page. Just it's broken into thirds vertically, and then it's broken into thirds horizontally. And forgive me if I start talking quickly, as I do when I start talking technically. With the two panels on top, maybe I'll make one that's 2/3 and one that's 1/3. But then within the 2/3 panel, if I want to put the character, like the point of interest within the thirds within that panel, it won't be within the third line on the page.
Okay.
Because now this is the kind of craziness that drives me insane.
Yeah, and I think you might be overthinking it at that point, or maybe I'm underthinking it. I don't know.
It's probably somewhere in between.
But I think what you have to do is you have to understand how people read the comic more than anything. We take when we turn to a comic page, we take an overall glance at the page, but for the most part, we go straight to the individual panels, and they become individual images as we read them.
Mhm.
So I understand what you're saying about overall page design, but I think when you might start getting into the thirds composition in each panel and wondering how it affects the other panels,
Mhm.
I don't know if your reader's even going to feel that. And
It
I notice I didn't say see that, feel it. That's
feel it. That's good point. And I think, yeah, it's a challenge because I also have to deal with my own neuroses.
don't
And
we all?
well, it really actually is a big problem because like if I'm producing something that I don't love myself, then yeah, I can get it done and maybe the reader will be fine with it, but I won't feel as good when I go to work the next day. And if I
No,
don't feel as
I
good
get
when I
it.
go, if I don't feel as good when I go to work the next day, I won't produce as good a job the next day, and that's like a snowball effect.
It's true, but you have to ask yourself: is it something that's is it something that you've become obsessed with,
Yes.
or is it something that is affecting the entertainment quality? Because I ultimately, and I have dealt with this, I've dealt with the same kind of things, and so I'm not saying that it's not a valid feeling, but I had to come to an understanding because I had so much less time to work on my second book than my first book.
Mm.
I had to ask myself, um, is the reader going to miss a lot of these elements that I'm not going to be able to put into the book?
Mhm.
And overall, no, they didn't.
Mm.
Um, what's important is the story and communicating that story clearly.
Mhm.
There's technical things I can look at and go, man, I wish I had more time to do that. But did it ruin the experience of the reader? Um, and I think of my well here. I was saying this to someone the other day, and it might have been you when we were talking. I see my first book as my Pixar film, my Disney film, my animated film. But because of the schedule of getting the second book done, I saw that second book as the direct to video sequel, where the story I'm still happy with the story,
Mm.
but there was a little bit less time and less resources to spend on the artwork.
Right.
So I wish I'd had a little more time, but I created some backdrops that I could just drag in
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
throw in just to keep me from having to redraw every background.
Yeah.
And the reader doesn't, I don't think the reader notices it for the most part
Mhm. Well,
because, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say with with Dreamset, I was forced to come up
Mm,
with some of those solutions, which I created a brush. Like I had a character. One of the I don't know if you discovered this about Clip Studio, but one of the wonderful things about Clip Studio
the
is it can
library.
create colored brushes
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
and ribbon brushes, so
Yes.
it'll follow the direction of the line. So I have a character that you've seen from my project that has
Hmm.
rainbow hair, this very long
Yeah.
rainbow floating hair, and I when I tell people how long it took me to draw that hair, it was on average it was taking me to fully render it with all of my procedures. It was 6 hours per illustration,
Right.
which is insane. And then I realized, there are 3 books in this series, and I've got about an average of 100 and about 100 like an average of 160 pages in each book, and on each page is an average of 3 illustrations, and this character's in about 75% of them. And
Yeah.
I thought, okay, that's 8 months of work to do hair. And I thought, all right, I got to figure out a smarter solution. And so what I did was I created a brush that has different pieces of hair.
Yeah.
I have a YouTube video about this if anyone's curious. So I had different pieces of hair: the top piece, the side piece, the back piece, kind of like you would actually produce a wig. And
Right.
then I drew that with different shadows on different angles. So I had like light coming from beneath, light coming from above,
Hmm.
etc. And then I would use the ribbon brush to just draw the hair now onto the head at different angles. And it's very convincing. That's the sort of thing that I looked at
Yeah.
and I said, okay, this is something nobody notices the difference.
Yeah. Well, coming from, there was a lot of waste at Disney feature animation when I was
Mhm.
there. These movies cost, millions of dollars, and people often wonder where all that money goes. Well, the money goes to labor. And
Mhm.
the cost of an animated film, for the most part, is labor. And I remember working on Tarzan, and I worked in the Florida studio. It was primarily a California and France film, but we were doing some of the background gorillas. And the gorillas were the way that we would do the drawings. They were primarily graphite, but if there was a line that was going to have a different color, or a not different color, but there was a line that was going to have a kind of a fade, where the one color will fade into another. We would draw that with a color race line, either a blue, usually a blue, so that the colorist would know this is where a fade would happen, or a gradation. So we're drawing these gorillas, and inside their nostrils, we have a little sep line there, little blue line, so that the inside color of the gorilla's nostril and the outside of its muzzle would have a nice little graduated, fade. And there were some other little details, very detailed stuff. So we're working on these scenes, and, it takes a lot of time to do that minute work. And when the movie's finished, they're in the background, very small, with the camera blur, and there's a camera movement. Tarzan's in the foreground. He just killed the jaguar. Sorry, spoilers. And he's beating his chest, and the camera's moving. There are all the gorillas. You can't see them. They're blurred. They're moving. Yet we spent all the time doing the details in their nostrils.
Yeah, that sort of thing came up even with my experience with Insomniac, where I still remember one case where there was an animator who was put on a task, I think for I would say a couple of months, to produce an element of one of the games that just got cut, and the artist had spent, I think it had done overtime hours for 2, maybe even 3 months, and unfortunately that section had to be cut. It was a design.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm out of NDA territory. Am I in NDA territory? So yeah, but basically, this is just the nature of things that happen in productions, where you have things that get a lot of time get spent on, and then just gets eliminated, and then you have to kind of swallow your art pride and go home, and then come back the next day and try again. Eddie, I got a question here for you.
Sure.
That I wanna get a response for. This is one I'm sure you've thought quite a lot about. I'm interested to know what Eddie thinks about 3D animation, especially in regards to Disney's decision to stop producing 2D classics altogether. And do you think the future of animation is entirely 3D?
No, I don't. Matter of fact, I think we've seen more of a variety of animation recently. We see a lot of stop motion. I mean, Leica studio up in where are they, in Oregon, doing beautiful stuff. Coraline and Kubo, beautiful work. And I think we're actually seeing more variety of animation than ever before. I love computer animation. I think it's taken animation to heights that we'd never seen before. I think the quality of acting is so good at this point, and subtlety of acting. I love hand-drawn animation, though. I love Disney animation, and I love the classics. I love what Walt's Nine Old Men did. I love the work of Milt Kahl and Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson. And there's nothing that's going to replace that. And I'm sad that Disney let that go. I know that John Lasseter and Ed Catmull tried hard to hold on to it, but it just wasn't possible. Unfortunately, what happened is the studio got into their mind that no one wanted to see traditional animation anymore, hand-drawn animation, because the Pixar films were doing so well. But the reason the Pixar films did so well is they were good stories. So I think we could see it come back at some point. But I love computer animation. And as a matter of fact, if Red's Planet is ever made into a feature film, I hope it's computer animation, because even though it's a hand-drawn comic, I think that computer animation will give it the feel and the acting that I would like for it to have.
Yeah, I can offer a few thoughts on that as well too. It's funny my approach to choosing the format really just comes down to the project's needs, and there are certain things that are easier to do in the computer. For example, I mean, I think I would have more fun, maybe, I don't know, but I think I would have more fun if I were to choose to draw this Yuka book totally traditionally, and I were to do it on paper, and I got out watercolors. Actually, I'd probably tear my hair out, because I need to edit things too much. But the point being that the procedure can be a little procedural,
Yeah.
when you're working digitally. But it gets me the kind of results I want, faster, better,
Yes.
cheap. And so that's kind of my philosophy is can I get it? And then I compare that to can I get the results I want? So a good example of this is specifically with ukulele. Uh, there was a point toward the beginning of the production when I thought I could integrate 3D models. So Clip
Mhm.
Studio actually allows you to use 3D models. So I contacted Platonic and
Yeah.
I asked them if I could use some of the 3D models from the game. And that because what I told them was, well, what if I'm working directly with the 3D models? Because then I can, first of all, it'll be very accurate. It'll look just
Mhm.
like the characters from the game. And then secondly, it'll save me a ton of time because using Clip Studio's tools, I can essentially bring the 3D, I can rough out the page, I can bring the 3D character in, pose the character out, and then make whatever edits needed to be made. And what I
Yeah.
found is two things happened. And I did do this for Dreamside as well. I had, what I did for Dreamside is I had the characters basically just a rough head shape because I
Sure.
need to redraw the expressions, but I would do the body in the body would be 3D. And that worked really well for Dreamside. I only adopted it, at the end, but now I've
Mhm.
got two more books to do. But with Yuka, what I found was it had two major problems. One is I could not get the range. It wasn't that I couldn't get the posing that I want. It's that I didn't have the control to feel out the posing that I wanted.
Mhm.
Even if I had kind of roughed it out, I thought, well, some of that creation comes in the finalization of the drawing. Where I'm like, oh, I'm going to stretch the limbs a little more. I'm gonna bend it this way just a little bit. I'm going to tilt the head a little more. Get the eye. So that has to come through for Yuka. That has to come through the drawing.
Right.
And I couldn't get that degree of expressiveness that I needed. But then the
Mhm.
second problem that happened is even if I could get the degree of expressiveness that I wanted, if I needed to edit something, which I almost always did, because some conversion of the 3D model into line work would have some messiness to it, or like the shadows wouldn't be quite accurate, I'd have to repaint that. And the repainting actually took longer than just doing it from scratch.
Interesting. Yeah.
So the 3D in that case added time, added complexity, and reduced the likability of the drawings.
Yeah. Interesting. I want to say one other thing about the computer animation, traditional animation question, because there is an element there that someone brought up to me, a Disney animator, that was fascinating, and I can't remember who said it, but there's something, the CG animation, the computer animation, people look at it and it's magic to them. They don't know how it's made. You don't see the strings. You don't see it's just there. It's beautiful. It almost looks like live action, but it's not a real person. But when you look at hand-drawn animation, um, no matter, even if a computer is involved, you see a drawing that comes to life, which is so unique. And the really cool thing about that is that a kid in Africa can see a drawing, an animated Disney film, and the drawing come to life and go, "That's a drawing. I I've got a piece of paper and I've got a pencil. I can make a drawing. Can I make that come to life?" And so there's an element of magic in hand-drawn animation that you don't quite get with computer animation. And that's one quality. And I think that's true too with seeing hand-drawn comics. And even though we're using digital means to create them, of seeing something that was touched by a human hand and not necessarily a computer model that was posed out and rendered out. There's the touch of the artist. And
Mhm. Yeah, and it's funny because a couple times with the dream set, actually almost universally with the dream set art, people seem to believe that a stage of it was done traditionally because I worked so hard to get that organic look,
yeah, yeah.
but it's not. It's all digital and it's all using digital techniques, and so but it's hand drawn in the same way. It's just
Yeah, and your drawing skills, your hand draw, the skills that you have as an artist that you could do on a piece of paper, actually dictate the way that you work with digital media. A lot of times,
yeah.
the aesthetics. Yeah,
The stupid way because I draw it out and I figure okay that'll be faster than
yeah,
I know the software has all these great tools but it just sometimes just bulldozing through is the best way, even if it takes a little longer. You have more fun.
I think so.
So yeah, yeah, that's interesting. And it's funny you mentioned something about the illusion of life, right? Which
Yeah.
is something that occurred to me about comics. And I was one of the things I wanted to do at some point, and I still do, is to do an animated comic. And when I say an animated comic, I don't mean like a motion comic. I
Hmm.
did this test a few years ago for it was actually a pitch to actually it was the very first attempted adaptation book. It was going to
Hmm.
be a Mario comic that I pitched to Nintendo. So I
Oh,
went
cool.
up, and I did actually get to have a meeting with Nintendo to pitch the comic. And I spent a lot of time doing this animated Mario sample. And what I did was I just did 2D animation basically, but I had to think about the logic of what I was designing. So I had to think a little bit like a designer, because interactivity, it would be a huge component. It's not just storytelling; it's interactivity to advance through the panels, but
Sure.
they would have a degree of motion. So what I would do is I would have what I called progression panels, and I would have
Hmm.
looping panels. And so the progression panels would tell a story from A to B, and then the looping panel would be C looped indefinitely.
Okay.
So it would be like a sentence and a period. So I had a panel one was Mario jump, like the little story for the test page is that Mario discovers the superstar. You played Mario, right?
Oh, yeah.
All right, so Mario discovers the superstar, and I have it like in this magical cave, and he jumps into the cave, and so I have him in panel one. It's a full fledged straight through animation of him jumping, seeing the star, running toward it, right, and you can see the star floating in the distance. It's all animated. The second panel, he jumps toward the star, and then in the third panel, he's just observing the star as it kind of it just floats with an idle animation. And so the third panel is the period. So what happens is if you're reading the panel, it would automatically advance between panels 1, 2, and 3, and then it would pause on 3 for you to advance at your own pace.
Interesting.
Yeah, and the fun of this, I thought this is actually quite a lot of fun. But the cool thing that this does from an aesthetic point of view,
Hmm.
I've got to give you a little bit of a story here. So when I first moved to Burbank, there was the Eaton Galleries. I don't know if you know the
Oh, yeah.
Van
Yeah.
Eaton Gallery. So they're a almost like a museum
Hmm.
that it also sells animation cells, and they had that was a magical experience to go in there, because they have art and drawings and everything from all these classic animated movies, everything from all over the world.
I didn't even know there was an actual gallery. I would have loved to have gone there.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's in it's on Ventura, I think. So
Okay.
they I went in there and I was picking up the drawings, and what I found was I remember picking up these Disney drawings that were from like I think they were from Sleeping Beauty. I think it was the witches, or not the witches, the
Oh,
fairies,
the
right?
fairies. Yeah.
And there were these drawings from that, and I remember looking at the drawing and thinking, "Oh my god, this is really appealing." And I thought, "This is weird because why is this one drawing, so appealing to me?" When I'm watching the movie, it is appealing, but I don't focus on it. I don't focus on the individual. I
Hmm.
mean, I know it's moving very quickly, but why is it that the scene doesn't have the same raw graphic appeal? And
Hmm.
I realized that it comes down to the illusion of life concept. So what happens with animation is that you don't see flat drawings anymore. You see flat drawings transformed, as you say, into life.
Yep.
And so what you're seeing is a three-dimensional scene, because your brain is convinced that it's happening in reality, right? Even though it's a series of drawings. But when you see the individual drawing, your mind allows it to flatten, and you can appreciate the graphic shapes
Yeah.
more simplistically and more directly.
Sure.
And so this is one of the beautiful parts of comics, because comics allow you to focus more on the graphic quality, whereas animation tries to suspend. It's almost like opposites in a
Yeah.
way. And so what I wanted to do with the animated comic was find a harmony between them, where it had the graphic presentation of a comic, but with the movement of animation,
Hmm.
but focusing on a looping structure. And actually, it's funny because I just noticed on Kickstarter that I don't remember the name, but there's a project that's doing just that, where they use,
Mm.
at least on their samples, they use animated gifs or gifs or whatever it is,
Yeah.
to demonstrate the motion, and it works. It looks spectacular.
Yeah. There's a few people who've done it and done it well. There was an artist in Utah who had um, motion comic, a baseball comic.
Yeah, Ryan Woodward's.
Yeah, Ryan Woodward, and that was really well done. He never did anything else with it, but it was well worth the reading the first one.
Well, he go ahead.
Oh, did he do something else with it? Did he?
No, oh no, not that I know of.
Yeah, but there was as far as just simple movement in comics. Cross-gen comics back in the early 2000s were over in the Tampa area, and they had the comics that they published in the comic shop. They had a flash version on their website that were really nicely done, just simple animation added to each one, but tastefully done, where it felt like there was movement, but it was still the comic that you would read in the comic shop. It wasn't overly done like some of the motion comics that Neil Adams is doing, but so it was a nice balance. Unfortunately, that was before the time that I could figure out how to rip things from the internet, because I would love to have those now, and the website's long gone.
Yeah. Hey, it's DM Combo. Yes, it is DM Combo. Hello, Yanseo. And how do I say that? Yanseo. I'm gonna say it's pronounced bananas until I hear otherwise. Okay, so thank you, bananas. Thank you for coming. So yeah, as far as the Woodward comic,
Yeah.
it was very cool and very inspirational. And maybe he ran into the problem that I ran into, because when I was pitching it to Nintendo, I used my typical Jack Russell method of just jumping off the cliff because I see a pretty bird in the air and I don't think about the ground.
Right.
So when I think the first question, and this is why Nintendo's Nintendo, and they are as strong of a company as they are, is the first question they have for me is, okay, and how? And how much is going to cost? And have you thought about this? And I realized that I was working in a company that did all that for me. And I realized, no, but it's a cool idea, isn't it? Yeah, it's a great idea. Go find a company that will, make this possible, because you've got to figure this out. So I went and pitched it to a game studio. I'm not going to tell you what the project was, because the studio seemed they didn't want this information getting out. But I did pitch it to a studio to do an animated comic, and we went through, and I got to give that studio credit, because they sat down with me for a good hour and a half to budget it out and think about, okay, how much will this cost? How much could it make? And what I very quickly realized is it's next to impossible to make enough money because you would lose money. Like it just
Sure.
to do that much animation, because the thing is, even though it was a comic, like it was still complicated animation. It was still traditional animation.
Yeah.
And so it didn't make sense. So I thought, all right, I have to shelve this. I'll start more simply. I'll do something that's not animated. And the closest thing I did to it was with Dreamside. I had my illustrations, and then I did like the parallaxing for the animated, the sort of quasi animated videos. But here's the funny part, Eddie. And this, as somebody who's come from animation, this must crack you up as much as it cracked me up. Is the biggest compliment, the most consistent compliment that I heard about those videos was, "Oh, I love the animation." And I don't know if people were saying that I don't know if they were translating animation to mean illustration, or if they were saying, "Oh, I love the movement itself."
It's movement. They think movement is animation.
Right, but all I was doing was just translating things around and zooming in and Z depth and that sort of thing.
They don't know that.
But and what that taught me was that, going back, we're kind of full circle here, which is where that's one of the things that taught me that you don't need to go crazy with animation to have something that will really reach people on an emotional level. And I thought, okay, so, and who figured this out? At least figured it out noticeably and still consistently produces in this manner is the Japanese animation industry, because they have a wonderful ability to segment their focus.
Yeah.
And they'll have lawn sections, lawn scenes, lawn shots that will not have an awful lot of animation, or will kind of almost use a television animation style where they'll do little pieces of it. But then they'll save their oomph for some significant movement. And then when they do it, they can put all their resources into those crazy shots. And so that's really neat to see.
Yeah, and I think they're much more prolific. At least Miyazaki has been in his lifetime, and he incorporates the same approach.
Yeah. So hola to our friend Sem, and Thank you for the heart. That's 2 hearts we've gotten today, Eddie.
Oh, good. 2 hearts.
I'm
Better
glad
than one.
I wore my nice shirt. Yes, and that's an interesting. It's interesting how the industries differ. I remember hearing that in the Japanese industry, they tend to record voices after the animation.
Yeah, that's interesting. So much of the performance in Western animation, or at least in American animation and Canadian animation, comes from the voice, the vocal performance.
Mm-hmm.
It inspires the animator, and oftentimes determines the animator's performance as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I almost wonder how they can manage to do that. How they can get the timing down just right, and then try and squeeze the voice in.
Well, I think you've got very few the timing on a like a Miyazaki animated film is controlled by very few people, and so he's getting. It's almost like the difference between Hollywood and an auteur filmmaker. So Miyazaki's the auteur. He is creating a very personal film in many ways, whereas Disney, it's a lot of people creating a movie. It's not one single person's vision. So I just think it's the difference between the two different styles of filmmaking.
It's an interesting transition for somebody to become an animator who's working on somebody else's vision,
Mm-hmm.
and an animator who is now directing his own vision and has convinced a bunch of other people to help him realize that vision, as Miyazaki did.
Yeah.
Because at some point he was, I don't know his full history, but my understanding was he was an animator on a team, right? Where I know that I think his first was the Castle of, is it Cagliostro? Is that how you pronounce it?
I don't know how you pronounce it, but yeah, Lupin. Was that I know I thought he directed one of those, or directed that film.
He did that. He did that one. I think that was his first film he directed. At least the first feature length.
Was it based on? It was based on manga, wasn't it?
I think so.
Yeah,
I think so. I don't know if that particular story was, because my understanding of Lupin is just kind of like the James Bond of the anime industry.
Yeah.
So, what a great movie!
Yeah, really. It is.
There's nothing quite like the Miyazaki movies. They really stick in your mind. They're so potent.
I know that Pixar oftentimes, at least they did back in the 90s, from some of the Pixar directors I talked to, whenever they found themselves in a position where they didn't know what to do with the story, they would screen a Miyazaki film. And part of the reason for that, I think, from talking to these guys, is the storytelling is so non-traditional and from a Western standpoint that it breaks you out of the thinking of the Western paradigm of story, and understand what the possibilities could be, where you could take your story that still works, but you never would have thought about that because it doesn't fit into that simple little, those cubby holes that all the screenwriters tell you to, or screenwriter gurus tell you to do. So it was I think a great way for them to break free of whatever story problems they were having, and open up to possibilities.
Yeah, and one of the things that I struggle with a lot is the fact that Miyazaki seems to have this ability, as a kind of to spin off to what you just said, which is that he has this amazing ability to be okay with oddly paced scenes. So I find that his movies always feel a little unbalanced to me, and I don't mean that in a bad way. At first, it really kind of bothered me. Like when I saw Spirited Away, which I think was one of the first movies I saw of Miyazaki's. I think Princess Mononoke was the first one, but it bothered me how the story had a very strange balance, where he would take a long time for scenes that seemed like not a lot was happening, and then he would have very quick scenes where it seemed a lot was being conveyed, or we were moving very quickly. I thought, this is odd pacing, and I used to think naively that this is like, they're so rushed in production, they didn't, they weren't able to realize, okay, maybe the scene should have been a little faster or shorter. And I'm sure that sort of thing has come up a little bit, but then I realized that he storyboarded the whole thing carefully, and
Mm-hmm.
advanced, and has obviously thought about the pacing of these shots
Yeah.
and the focus.
Yeah. Absolutely. And
Well, just to finish that thought real quick, in particular, the way that I think I realized that, oh no, this is a work of genius, was in Spirited Away when I watched it a few more times. And a scene that works like this, for example, is the train scene. Uh,
yeah, it's
so,
gorgeous.
well, it's a gorgeous scene, but what's funny is it does something else. Is that when you then watch the movie later, maybe years later, the train scene makes you very bizarrely emotional.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a long scene. It's probably a good 3 minutes that Chihiro is just transferring right to this
Mm-hmm.
other location. It's not even like that she's searching. There's not action on her part.
Mm-hmm.
So you're at a challenging part of the movie where Chihiro now has to like get to the climax of the story and has to become the hero, right? But when she gets to the island, she's kind of right there at that bizarre cabin scene.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not a lot of challenge, but what she's doing is the challenge is occurring in her mind, of course, at that time. But the scene is 3 minutes long or so.
Mm-hmm.
At least it feels like it is, and
Yeah.
it just cuts in almost like an intermission. It's a strange thing, oddly paced. But then you realize how emotionally affecting the scene is.
Mm-hmm.
And now that it's been how many years has it been since the movie came out? I can't watch that scene without getting really emotional. And I think
But
that's genius.
so the thing is, it took 3 or 4 times for you to watch that movie to break through the neural programming that Hollywood had instilled in your head
Mm-hmm.
of what a story should be. Because whether we realize it or not, we will judge a movie on the first 10 minutes of the film. And if it doesn't hit those points that we know, if it doesn't hit that inciting incident at the exact time that it's supposed to, then we tune out and go, I don't like this movie. I don't get this movie because it's not delivering what we've been programmed
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, to 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 get the information that we've been programmed to get from a story.
Mm-hmm.
And most screenwriting courses teach you to hit certain things on certain pages or within certain pages. And I think when you see a film like Japanese films, which has a different speed of filmmaking, most Japanese, Akira Kurosawa was much more of a Western style director, and his films had a much more Western style of pacing. But when you watch a Miyazaki film, it is different. It is what he thinks the story should be, and not what a studio is saying. You need to trim this here and hit this moment a lot sooner. So,
So how does this concept tie into comics? So
mm,
what I'm curious about is, so you obviously have now, have you developed more than Red's Planet in specific in comics
I've
specifically?
I've got some ideas. I'm not sure if I'll get to them in my lifetime. Just from the necessity to make a living,
Hmm.
and comics take a long time. Um, so I have other ideas. And a story that I'd like to do that's
Hmm.
based on a real life event of my grandfather, who actually was sent by President Franklin Roosevelt to go to Alabama to pick up a trunk full of moonshine.
Oh, okay.
True story. And I thought, unfortunately, my grandfather's gone, and I can't ask him questions. But I started realizing there's a story there somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So I have stories I'd love to work with. But one thing that that's important to me is I want to tell these stories the way that I want to tell them.
Hmm.
And um, and much like we were talking about Miyazaki, I want to tell them in the pace that I want to tell them, in the style that I want to tell them, and not necessarily make them into uh, what Hollywood would expect to be a blockbuster.
Hmm. Yeah, and if I can just bring this back to Yuka for a second. So actually, I'll bring it to Dream side for a second. So since I come from game design,
Hmm.
originally it was trained in school for animation, and
Hmm.
I did a little bit of work in animation. But really, what I very quickly realized is that when I worked in animation at Insomniac Games, I had to think more in terms of game design I had to think of like a game designer animator more than an animation game designer.
Sure.
And the reason that's important is that when you're thinking about design, you treat things like a puzzle, and you think about things like pacing in a different way. Like
Hmm.
what is the player's pacing? So I'm still thinking like a game designer, and I love games. I play games a lot, so I always like to have an experience.
Yeah.
That is something that I like to put in my work that I think would be something that goes outside the sort of Hollywood framework in the sense. So in Dreamside Book One, I have a whole chapter. Things happen in the chapter, but it doesn't feel like it when you read it because it's almost like a euphoric playground scene where uh, you sort of earned this, right? Because there's 4 chapters of struggle, and there's sort of this scene that kind of just experience. This is when the characters end up going to Dreamside for the first time,
Hmm.
and it's just this big playground. Now, a lot of things are happening in the back of your brain while you're reading the scene because it's explaining how the world builds itself, how it constructs in real time for Sarah,
Sure.
and that. But I wanted to make sure that you can just exist in this world. And one of my favorite things with games is when they allow you to just exist in a playground. Games like Ukulele, actually, it's one of the
Yeah.
reasons they appeal so much to me, even though it's a very different vibe. Ukulele has this incredible play feel where the environments are like massive toy boxes,
Hmm.
and uh, you basically you're just dropped in, and there's all this fun stuff that you can do. You have to find it, but everywhere that you look there's something, and if you keep walking you'll find some quirky character that you can talk to, and it'll give you a challenge, or you can, oh, what's that thing up in the distance? Oh, there's something at the top of that tree. I got to go find out what that is, and I got to find out how to get up to the tree. And so it's very much like a child in a playground
Yeah.
where you see the fun thing that you want to do. Okay, oh, there's a bigger slide over there, so oh, but wait, how do I get up? I've got to figure out how to climb up the slide. So I like to put that in storytelling. And with Dreamside, that chapter was very much that case where I stretched out the pacing
Hmm.
so that you could just sit in the world and get a feel for it.
Sure.
And I know that that's just the sort of thing that I would be told to cut down on because it's too decadent.
Yeah.
But the decadence of it is first of all, I think it's earned at that
Hmm.
point, pacing wise, and secondly, the decadence is key to the story because I need the audience to feel what Sarah feels at that point, which is
Yeah.
the sort of euphoric escape from her chains in the hospital.
Yeah. I went through the same kind of thing in Red's Planet Book 2. There was I was a little bit late with the book. Meant for it to come out earlier, but I didn't get it finished. There was always an election scene in the movie or in the book, because I always loved the elections in the Pogo comic strip.
That was Walt
If
Kelly, right?
Yeah, Walt Kelly, and Walt Kelly was the first to put politics into the comic strip pages. If it weren't for Walt Kelly, we would not have had Doonesbury or Bloom County or a number of strips now that talk politics. Now, Walt Kelly did it in a very nonpartisan kind of way. He really poked fun at the process, and poked fun at the presidents and some of the candidates, but did it in a way that it wasn't mean spirited.
Mhm.
And he poked fun of Joseph McCarthy. I mean, some of his best strips were talking about the McCarthy era of looking for communists under every rock and in Hollywood. So Walt Kelly had this great, and they would have elections, and they would try to get Pogo to run, and he never wanted to, and they were just crazy because they were nothing like the elections we had, because they were all a bunch of weird, not very educated swamp creatures. So I always wanted to have this kind of aspect in Red's Planet, and it also, I recognized it would be kind of fun to see these two characters who are in this contest of wills to compete for the acceptance of the rest of the community.
Mhm.
And then when it all backfires, and the election, it's nothing like the election we would see. Things like the debate turns into kind of a Jeopardy kind of game where one character can never get the answers right because it's all kind of tipped in the other character's favor. And then the second part of it ends up in them actually racing a gauntlet, that looks like something from one of the American Ninja episodes, and where they have to capture the flag at the end because then that will be the winner of the debate. So I was having a lot of fun with it, but I also knew that it was building tension, and then ultimately, when you get to the outcome of the election, it builds a connection between Red and Goose, an emotional connection, and there's also a scene right after that where just for a few pages where we talk about baseball and how baseball is actually, I had this theory, in the comic, within the mythos of the comic, that baseball is actually a sport that spread, or lifestyle, if you will, that spread throughout the universe by this Johnny Appleseed kind of character who comes and he's kind of a shapeshifter, I can imagine, although I don't tell this story in the book. And he takes on he shares baseball with everyone, and everyone plays it in a different way, and but they make it their own. And some actually settled diplomatic disputes with it. Others have been, play it with a hunk of cheese, and whatever it may be. It's just something that they all kind of come together and find something in common. And so those were things that a lot of people looked at and go, yeah, why are we doing an election? Didn't we just have the craziest election in the universe? Why do we have to have another crazy one? And why are we doing baseball? These seem like narrative digressions to a lot of people, but it was a way for me to build relationships, very real emotional relationships with my characters.
Yeah. This makes me think of the.
I was just going to say that a lot like what Miyazaki was doing.
Yeah, and that's I don't normally talk about the fact that I love a lot of scary media. I'm a big horror fan, and I find actually comedy and horror have a lot in common. And the Dreamside, despite the fact that it has a young, I would say it's for younger people. It has some very scary scenes. And
it does, yes.
Well, the first book has some, but the second book, which is coming after it's coming after the first, Eddie.
Go figure.
Yeah, it has some very scary scenes, very, very, very scary scenes, and I haven't rubbed down the spikes in it, which is something kind of fun for me because when you work in a production environment, the more people you have contributing, the more people want to kind of, the more somebody's going to bring up that, okay, this is a little sharp. You got to kind of whittle this down because it's going to be too much of a spike.
Yep.
And you're going to have a scene that's comfortable, and then you're going to have a scene that's too uncomfortable, and it's going to bother people, and they usually are right. But with Dreamside, I wanted like one luxury I afforded myself was allowing the spikes to exist as I felt they needed to be. Just assuming that I had done my due diligence in the story and made sure that they were needed, they were required, and they were good in terms of their relative positioning with the whole story. That there's a progression of spikes, and it's not just like a sudden huge jump. Right. But there are definitely some scenes in there that you will not see in typical children's media. Part of that just comes from my love of the sort of drama that you get from from horror. But horror and comedy are both very, very similar because they both elicit a strong emotional response where you're screaming with horror and you're laughing with comedy, but in both cases they're exaggerated and both have more in common with animation, I think. And so I actually think horror and comedy really have a lot in common. And to me, that's one of the reasons I think Dreamside and Yuka are surprisingly related, because the Yuka, I'm trying very hard to elicit as much laughter as possible.
Sure.
And create absurd scenes. I can't wait to share with people. Such crazy scenes in this book. And with Dreamside, it's certainly more of a drama piece. Almost no humor in the story. It's very, very
it's a serious subject matter.
It's a serious subject matter, but I don't even really have a lot of the levity that you typically have with, you got to, we got to give people a little bit of a breather, so I can kind of keep you in an emotional state for a certain period of time. That's
But being a horror fan, you know that the best horror films have very funny lines and things that it's not just they break the tension, but they prepare you for the next tension. If you didn't have those breaks, the next tension would not seem as great.
it's
It
a
provides
contrast.
contrast.
Yeah. And I do try to provide contrast in a slightly different way. It's just that
Hmm.
it never, at least in book one, which is heavily expository,
Hmm.
which I tried to keep it interesting. There's a lot to convey. Uh, there are different ways of doing it other than kind of breaking up the reader. And one way that I do it is through a state of kind of fluctuating between a state of horror and a state of euphoria.
Hmm.
And so it just, instead of comedy, I do euphoria. I try
Sure.
and make it seem dreamy. And so when people look at the art of Dreamside, they might notice that some of the pieces, like for example, even pieces that are in the hospital, are extraordinarily colorful. They use
Hmm.
rainbows as motifs. Uh, what they're doing is they're creating sort of they're creating a sort of the characters existing in a state of comfort and dreaminess, and that as a reader, I think that puts you in a comfortable state as well. You're not laughing, but
Sure.
you're at ease, and that's a
Hmm.
different way to provide contrast, especially
Hmm.
because you're not going to expect some of the scary things that happen in the story. But a lot of that relates to the subject matter. So yeah, I think there are a lot of different ways of providing that contrast.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's the principle of contrast is really important to storytelling. You you can't pull out all the stops, no matter what you're doing, whether it's comedy or horror. You can't pull out all the stops from the very beginning and expect to sustain that level. You've got to build to it. You've got to have think of it as a roller coaster. You don't just jump into all the big hills. You build up to it, and there's variety all through the ride. And
Mm.
the same thing with storytelling.
Yeah, I had some reactions to Dreamside initially. I had a very good thought that somebody had provided, but it was one that didn't work.
Hmm.
Which was that, oh, wouldn't it be nice if you sort of played with color? And it was a little bit of it was like actually one of the first thoughts I had. And I thought, okay,
Hmm.
this is a little cliche, but I thought, okay, when Sarah goes to the dream world, it'll be very colorful, and when she's in the real world, it'll be a little more gray,
Hmm.
and that provides a certain type of contrast. And then I thought, well, it's actually not two worlds; it's three worlds.
Hmm.
There's the real world, and then it's bookended by the dreams and the nightmares.
Hmm.
And so dreams and nightmares use colors in different ways, but the real world also has color, because the real world is not a state of horror, and that plays into the story. But I'll stop before I give anything away.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
color has always been something that filmmakers have used to tell stories. Stanley Kubrick very
one of my
effectively
favorites. Yeah.
used color in Full Metal Jacket with green and red, um, where you've got if you go back and look at the film, everything's green in the very beginning. They've got the basic training, but he starts to introduce red into it. The floor of the barracks is red.
Mm,
I mean, realistically, how many barracks do you know actually had a red floor?
mm,
And so green becomes the color of civilization and of structure, and then red starts to introduce this aspect of anarchy. And by the final shot in the movie is completely red.
mm,
You've got the fire burning in the background and the silhouettes of the soldiers in the foreground, and the way that he goes back and forth and controls that color. And I know that he sat there because he shot everything in England because he didn't fly anywhere, and spray painted grass to get it all green. And not that you have to work that hard in England to make everything green, but just the kind of control he spent to get the color right.
mhm.
So color has always been an effective storytelling tool, and oftentimes as film viewers, we don't notice it.
Right,
It's we feel it, but we don't notice it. If you do notice it, they did it wrong.
right.
So
Yeah. Well, so I'll tell you what, I think we're getting on here probably about an hour and a half in, which is a
yeah,
bit longer than we'd expect to go. But it's so interesting talking to you, Eddie. I feel like I could talk for hours, and that makes me think that we should probably definitely do this again,
let's do it.
especially as a way of kind of documenting our progress. I plan to share a lot of ukulele's production over the course of the next 6 to 7 months, provided the project is funded.
Great.
And so, I want to get on here as often as possible and be sharing with people, because I know with Kickstarters, Kickstarter has kind of a reputation to work through. That when you introduce something that's so new, which Kickstarter actually still really is. We haven't quite crossed the hump of how to maintain, how to incorporate responsibility to the backer,
Mm-hmm.
and also be able to deliver something when you don't have a traditional production model.
Right.
And so one of the reasons that I spent 2 years before I took it to Kickstarter is because I knew I needed to see the light at the end of the tunnel before I asked anybody for any money, because I thought I need to be able to guarantee, okay, in 6 months, I know that's the time, and I can do it now.
Right.
And unfortunately, that took 2 years to get to this point, but also to be able to lay things out in a logical way, figure out the pricing of everything, and find the right companies to work with. It's a complicated process. So one thing that's really important to me is to stay in touch with backers and make sure that people know that exactly what's happening. At least on a weekly basis after the campaign. So
Yeah.
it would be a great to jump on with you, Eddie, and be able to share our experiences back and forth.
Yeah. Anytime. Love to do it.
Right. Is there anything you want to bring up here other than I'm definitely going to be plugging your book here.
No,
So
thanks, man.
yes, you've got to pick up a copy of Red's Planet. Now there are two of these, and
Yep.
like a jerk, I have not bought your second book yet.
That's okay.
I do have the first.
Red's Planet. Yeah, you can keep up with me on social media, and usually you can find me in all my social media at redsplanet.com or eddiepittman.com, and I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So just come find me somewhere.
Wonderful. And if anybody's interested in backing Ukulele and the Cracklestone, the link is in the description below. So this will be on my channel. So if you want to share the video later on, you can. And, also I've got tons of live streams planned through this campaign. I've got somebody different every day, at least for the next 2 weeks. So who knows who's going to be next? Well, I do actually. But yeah, it'd be great to jump on again with Eddie. Is there anything you want to say before we sign off?
Oh, that's it. But thanks for having me. I'm excited to see the graphic novel, and I know it's going to be amazing.
Oh, I appreciate that, Eddie, and I'm going to do my best to make that happen. All right, we're going to sign off, and thanks everybody for coming. We'll see you next time.